All right, hi everyone. My name is Rob Doggett. I'm with the State University of New York at Geneseo and the International Yeats Society, and I'm here with Stephanie Burt, who's a professor of literature at Harvard. It's great to see you, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm happy to see you.
And we're going to
Looking
talk
forward to this.
about Coole and Ballylee, 1931. Before we do that, though, I just thought I'd ask you real quick. I actually just got your book, Don't Read Poetry, fairly recently, and
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
really I got through. I've read the first chapter, and I'm going to definitely use it in my classes when I'm teaching my intro to poetry class. So it's going to be
Thank you so
exciting.
much.
So what are you working on right now?
Um, so we're still trying to promote the book that came out this spring, which is called After Callimachus. It's a book of adaptations and semi-translations of my favorite poet of classical antiquity, Callimachus,
Right?
who was a friendly, thoughtful, occasionally sarcastic, creative, pedagogically innovative, and very queer figure. Um, there's going to be another book of poems sooner or later. There might be a some co-written fiction. Let's see.
Okay.
Uh, and let's see. I just sent off a fairly long piece about a comics creator named Bishak Sam, who does autobio comics and also sort of magic realist fantasy comics, which I like very much.
Hmm.
And I am part of a five-person collective, and we're writing a book for Columbia University Press about the X-Men.
Oh my gosh. Well, you are. I thought I was busy. You are certainly busy.
I'm lucky. I have good collaborators. I have good people I want to work with, and there's a lot to say about the X-Men that has either not been said or not been said in print. So our favorite mutants need us, especially now.
That's great. So,
Rob, are you an X-Men fan?
I'm not. I'm not. I'm sad to say. I'm
You're
not.
not.
I'm not much of a. I'm honestly not much of a comics guy.
That's okay.
I never really got into it. I do like. We talked one time. I do like role playing games quite a bit. So
Yeah,
that was a big
uh,
thing for me.
I've got a role playing game tonight.
Awesome. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Coole and Ballylee, 1931. I asked you to pick any poem you wanted, and that's the one you picked. And so, what was it about that poem that was interesting to you?
It does so many things I admire. It describes at length in a way that's never just description. It has a peculiarly Yeatsian dual perspective on the past and the future at once.
Yeah.
Um, it has a peculiarly Yeatsian, or really sort of late Yeats-y, and a very fit for our moment way of seeing how screwed up everything is, how imaginable a continuation of current terrifying trends are, and yet of finding resources in the past that might let us envision a more hopeful future.
Hmm.
It has a sense of the dignity not just of the poet, but of his friends and collaborators. It has one of my favorite things about middle and late Yeats, which is as much, I mean, there's so many things to like, right? There's the technical innovation, there's the sound patterns, but there's also the sense that he's not alone and you're not alone. And no matter how dignified and tragic and romantic and pissed off he gets, and no matter how deserted he feels, he's not all by himself. He is part of an enterprise with others. And he's quite aware that his accomplishments and the accomplishments of the part of culture he represents are not his alone.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and that the elegiac quality of the poem always comes through for me in those moments when he's talking about the house and about alluding to Augusta Gregory, who's who's dying upstairs, and the walking about up there, and the memory of Robert Gregory.
Yeah, who
But that
he's already memorialized in other poems.
That's right, and the
Right.
sense of, but I think you're right. The sense of being part of something. That line, the famous line, "We were the last romantics." I've heard sometimes people say, "Oh, Yeats called himself the last romantics," and forgetting
No,
about
it's
the
the
we.
plural.
Yeah, the plural
He
there.
would never call himself alone the last romantic.
Yeah, that's right. So
It's
that sense.
this part of the Yeatsian enterprise, not just about trying to preserve and honor the aristocratic heritage of these houses, which you could say they're better off as public libraries, not how he felt, but his felt and maintained connection to Irish and even to Irish language culture, because of course
Yeah.
Yeats wasn't someone like Douglas Hyde who could just go around doing everything in Irish.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, his connection to folklore came partly through a shared effort that was led by Lady Gregory.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's great. That idea of collaboration in this poem. Let's, if you don't mind, I usually ask people to read the poem. So if you don't mind reading it, and I'm going to try to share my screen, which has the poem on it.
Okay.
Here we are.
Coole and Ballylee, 1931. And I'm going to read this in my American accent because that's what I've got. Under my window ledge the waters race, otters below and moorhens at the top, on the top. Run for a mile undimmed in heaven's face, then darkening through dark raftery's cellar drop, run underground, rise in a rocky place, in cool domain, and there to finish up, spread to a lake and drop into a hole. What's water but the generated soul? Upon the border of that lake's a wood, now all dry sticks under a wintry sun. And in a copse of beeches there I stood, for nature's pulled her tragic buskin on, and all the rant's a mirror of my mood. At sudden thunder of the mounting swan I turned about and looked where branches break the glittering reaches of the flooded lake. Another emblem there, that stormy white but seems a concentration of the sky. And like the soul, it sails into the sight, and in the morning's gone, no man knows why, and is so lovely that it sets to right what knowledge or its lack had set awry. So arrogantly pure, a child might think it can be murdered with a spot of ink. Sound of a stick upon the floor, a sound from somebody that toils from chair to chair. Beloved books that famous hands have bound, old marble heads, old pictures everywhere. Great rooms where traveled men and children found content or joy, a last inheritor where none has reigned that lacked a name and fame, or out of folly into folly came. A spot whereon the founders lived and died seemed once more dear than life. Ancestral trees or gardens rich in memory glorified, marriages, alliances, and families, and every bride's ambition satisfied. Where fashion or mere fantasy decrees, we shift about all that great glory spent, like some poor Arab tribesman in his tent. We were the last romantics, chose for theme traditional sanctity and loveliness. Whatever is written in what poets name the book of the people, whatever most can bless the mind of man or elevate a rhyme, but all is changed, that high horse riderless, though mounted in that saddle, Homer rode, where the swan drifts upon a darkening flood.
That's nice, Stephanie. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. So we're looking at a house, and the house isn't going to be around forever. And neither is the hydraulic system or the water system that Yeats begins by contemplating.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
the water system, while tumultuous when it rains and when it's cold, doesn't seem like it's in any danger of going away. Whereas the inherited system that the house represents, that generations have moved through and enjoyed content and heritage and held parties and been married in, that is going to go away. And it's going to go away not because something better is replacing it, but because to Yeats's mind, something worse is replacing it.
So the stream, just for people who aren't familiar with the stream here, the stream at Yeats's tower goes through apparently an underground passage that then emerges back at Coole Park, Lady Gregory's estate. So this kind of connection of the water. And then at the time the poem's written, the house had been bought by the government. Gregory was still living there, though she
Yeah,
was dying.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, Coole Park is now owned by the government of the Irish Republic.
Yeah.
You can go there. Um, it was passing into the hands of a nation state that Yeats did not trust.
Hmm. Hmm.
Did not trust to preserve what he thought of as folklore and culture and tradition and nobility.
Hmm.
Partly because at the time it seemed more about promoting religious doctrine
Hmm.
to him
Hmm.
than about promoting traditions that were older than and other than the church.
Yeah, that idea of custom and ceremony that we get
Yeah.
so often in the later Yeats.
Yes. Yes. And Yeats has a sense of having been involved in a collective enterprise
Hmm.
in carrying forward the Book of the People, which is not going to be written in anymore, which, like the white of the clouds reflected in the lake, can be murdered with a spot of ink.
Yeah, so the
Um,
fragility of
yeah,
that.
yeah. And one of the things, I could have, in terms of timeliness, if it weren't so long, I might well have asked us to discuss instead one of the Civil War poems, 1919, or Meditations in Time of Civil War, which are timely for me because they're about norm breaking.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're about the kind of small c conservative attitude that Yeats represents in his poems. And those are one of the attitudes that I do find valuable as a person alive in 2020. Yeats is not Yeats is not someone whose attitudes are ever democratic. Um, but Yeats is someone whose attitudes are quite valuable to me now, in that he's interested in why we do things, why we've done things in a certain way for so long.
I was talking to my
What
students.
we lose if we just sort of smash them up and say now we can do whatever we want.
I was trying to explain because I was reading Burke with my students and
Yep.
Edmund Burke and
Which
talking a
one?
little
Which
bit
Burke? Which,
the reflections on the revolution.
oh,
And so they were having, and they all wanted to slam Burke right away and disagreed. And I disagree with Burke quite a bit too, but that in a lot of things. But I'm finding it resonating a bit too, that small c conservatism of these kinds of traditions and what they're referring to in the States a lot these days as norms that
a
kind
hundred
of
percent,
together,
a
right?
100%. Yeah, yeah. I had the weird good fortune to take an entire seminar on Burke as a writer and thinker in graduate school with David Bromwich, who has been obsessed with Burke for 30 years.
Hmm.
And his thing was the revolution, the reflections on the revolution in France is just one book that Burke wrote, and the best, Burke's best work is done earlier,
Hmm.
before he gets so upset about Marie Antoinette. Um,
Yes.
and things like his defenses of party government and his speech to the electors at Bristol, and his speech saying, "Why on earth are we intervening in the American Revolution?
Hmm. Hmm.
That's just stupid."
What?
It's great stuff, and it's very much about wanting to preserve habits
Yeah.
and wanting to make change with something other than a bulldozer.
Mhm.
And this is a poem, getting back to what Yeats is doing, that is attempting not only to honor and memorialize the house that will, Yeats is afraid, be gone soon and will not be kept up. And I think Yeats is afraid not only that the house will not be honored, but that it will be allowed to be physically decrepit.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but also Yeats is himself constructing these units. And he doesn't always do this with Ottava Rima. He does a lot of different things with Ottava Rima. What he's doing here with his 8-line stanzas is to construct units that you can inhabit and move through and live in, that, especially in the middle of the poem, are a bit like a house tour. You can't go to Coole Park. You can't, walk the staircases if
Yeah.
you're reading this poem in, uh, you know, Auckland or Seattle or wherever you are. And Yeats does have a worldwide audience at this point. Um, but you can envision the physical spaces as well as the generations of people who Yeats wishes to honor. And one of the things he's doing with those sound effects
Yeah.
is emulating the house tour. And that's one of the reasons that these Ottava Rima stanzas differ so much one from another.
Mhm.
Each stanza has a different shape. The first stanza, which is the outdoor hydraulic stanza, gives you the water course and then one line, so that the grammar is absolutely at odds with the rhyme scheme. Drop into a hole. For a lesser poet, that would be where you end the stanza.
Right.
But Yeats has this rhyme left. What's water but the generated soul? Does he do that again? He does not. He brings you to the present instead of diachronically following the water. We are going to be standing in a place. We get what a cinema director would call a sort of establishing shot.
Mhm.
And then we figure out for the first time who's speaking and where he's standing. It's the first person pronoun.
Yeah. So sort of panning out there now, we see the whole lake and the woods and the season, a sense of the seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have been told that Yeats is upset about something. All the ransom mirror of my mood,
Mhm.
right? The clouds are perhaps moving by rapidly overhead. Um, it's never entirely been clear to me whether in that stanza it is actually raining, because there are dry sticks,
Mhm.
but there also seems to be a rainstorm. It could work either way.
Mhm.
Uh, and then Yeats is going to take another stanza and do something else, which is to tell you how to interpret this.
Mhm.
Except that he's not going to tell you everything. He's going to tell you that he's very moody. He's in a mood that is connected to macro historical and cosmic change,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that something is going down, and that he's going to be very Yeatsian about this and imagine a cyclical constellation for what might seem at first like permanent destruction.
Mhm. Yeah.
But we still don't know why he's upset,
Yeah.
right? We're getting, it's as if we were watching him put together a one act play and he were bringing on stage all of the sets and all of the props. And he were there as the director and sort of the narrator. But we have to wait until we are halfway through this 6 stanza poem before we meet any people
Mhm.
and before we go indoors.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but you're right. Just the movement we feel of sort of being on the estate, setting up that kind of context. We don't know why he's so upset, even as he's pointing out these things around me have this symbolic importance. And sort of, we get some sense of that. Okay, the rivers, like maybe the reincarnated soul, the life, underground death, rebirth, or the swan perhaps as a symbol of poetic inspiration. But we don't have all of the sort of context for what's going on, even as he's pointing up all these symbols outside. And then we move, you're right, then we move to the house. And that sound of a stick upon the floor is really, I think, so
Yeah,
moving to think about Augusta Gregory walking about upstairs, ill, dying.
that's right. Um, Once we're halfway through, we go indoors and we learn why Yeats is upset.
Yeah, yeah,
And he doesn't say, I'm upset because Augusta Gregory is dying. That's a different poem. Um, and in this poem, that's not really why he's upset. He's upset because there's not going to be another inheritor. He's upset because this estate will keep up neither its physical beauty, which in fact, as you might expect, happened.
mhm.
Um, it was not initially maintained by the Irish government. Um, the estate won't be maintained, and the things that the estate represented will not be maintained.
I
The
think
book
that
of the people will be blotted in, if not blotted out, and the dignity that Yeats sees in country houses, which your mileage may vary,
mhm.
but in inherited ways of doing things
I think that sense,
gone away.
first of all, as you're talking about the physicality of the house, there's a sense of this kind of immensity. And I don't mean like the size of the house, but how much the house contains on one level is physical. And I remember there's a quote Yeats said about Coole Park. He said something like, I heard somebody say Balzac would have given 20 pages to the stairs. So just this,
Yeah,
like this of the of what's inside the home physically, but this all of this art, et cetera. But also, as you're saying, like the immensity of what it represents in terms of cultural heritage
yeah,
and a place of that supports the arts, and
yeah,
that he had relied on
yeah,
most of his life.
yeah. And it is extremely Burkean.
Yeah, yeah.
It is also, from the 21st century point of view, a polemical claim about ascendancy architecture and uh, ascendancy, people and buildings and families
Mhm,
as being characteristically and traditionally Irish.
mhm.
And again, your mileage may vary. And
But
what Yeats wanted to envision, and he believed that with Lady Gregory in particular that he had, um, aristocrats who were devoted to the well-being of the rural working class,
yeah, yeah,
including Irish speakers, including people who had been historically very much hosed by power far away. Um, and that's not a contemptible thing to envision.
no, it's a complicated one to talk about with what I find in talking to my students about it, and that idea of Yeats's vision of an aristocratic, a kind of benevolent aristocracy. But it's a fantasy, and it's in certain moments in these poems, it's a really beautiful fantasy. And it's understandable because in the end, what he's after is a society that believes in the value of art, that cherishes creation,
Yeah,
and that's a noble end.
yeah, and a society that's not driven by money.
That's right.
I mean, this is the other thing about this poem. If you're coming at it looking for politics, is that it's extremely anti-capitalist.
Yes.
The last thing he wants is absentee landlords and investment bankers and financialization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I wonder about the next. So a spot whereon the founders lived and died. That stanza. I'm always that in the middle of that. We have that interesting line, and every bride's ambition satisfied.
Yeah, it's fun. Uh, and the next thing you get is somebody taking down a tent pole, and it's sexual.
Yeah.
Um, Yates is, for his time and point of view, uh, very in favor of sexual pleasure.
Yeah.
And every bride's ambition satisfied means both, I think, that the marriages that were celebrated and perhaps consummated in this house did not lower the social standing of the brides
Hmm.
because they were brought up in such a way as to attract and retain socially appropriate husbands.
Right.
And also,
Whoops. Did you mute there for a second?
I don't think so.
Oh, you cut
Also,
out for a second. Okay, say that
they,
again. I'm
they,
sorry.
they had fun in bed.
I was worried
Brides,
maybe the government's starting to
no,
censor us. I
the
don't know.
brides had fun. The brides had fun in bed.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's both. So then that yeah, like they made a socially appropriate marriage, and there's also this kind of sexual joy that comes out of the marriage. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Eternity's passion, girl and boy cry at the onset of their sexual joy. Um, and there's a sex joke at the bottom of that.
Right.
That's also one of these stanzas where Yeats is showing off by showing you how many abstract francophone or Latinate words he could pack into a line
Mm-hmm.
because he's surrounded them with words that are more sensory and vivid.
Mm-hmm.
Marriages, alliances, and families, and every bride's ambition satisfied, where fashion or mere fantasy decrees mansion. And there's nothing to see there.
Mm-hmm.
But then we get a tent, um, uh, and the suggestion there is that you shouldn't treat Irish great houses the way that nomads in nomadic cultures treat housing.
That's right. And that idea, I think of a prayer for my daughter, the idea of custom ceremony tied with rootedness.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and that's not everyone would choose that. We don't always have to stay where you're born,
mhm,
but you should be able to.
mhm.
It is a great loss if you can't stay where you're born. Um,
And so now we get the
yeah,
last stanza, and the most
the
famous
most famous one.
stanza.
And we should also mention, wasn't the single Ottava Rima unit called "The Choice" carved out of this?
Yeah.
So the poem, the 8-line poem that in Yeats's books is called "The Choice," which begins: "The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life and of the work, and if it choose the latter, must refuse a heavenly mansion, laboring in the dark."
Mhm,
That wonderful complaint that Auden, who never got over Yeats, liked to make fun of.
mhm, mhm.
I taught an Auden seminar about 10 years ago, and I love Auden, but it is really remarkable how Auden just never got over Yeats, and even at the end of his life, Auden still is dealing with echoes of Yeats that he doesn't want to admit are there.
Mhm.
In any case, there was a stanza about poetic vocation and how hard it is you have to work to be a poet or an intellectual or a writer of any kind in here, and Yeats took it out because he didn't want to. And of course, he took it out. It doesn't belong here. It's about him, and it's about writers.
Mhm.
And this is not a poem about him. This is a poem about him with others. Him. It's about us, and about how to remember a group endeavor that might be coming to a close. And how to imagine that the endeavor might not be gone forever. Because once you have a flood and a swan and a horse, those are notably not images of death. They're images of wildness and chaos. I mean, the swans can be images of the end of everything. Elsewhere, the swan is left into the desolate heaven. That image brings a rage to end all
Hmm.
things.
Hmm. Hmm.
But this is not exactly a funeral.
So even though the people are fading away, and the
Yeah,
horse is riderless,
yeah.
the creation can still carry on. The collective endeavor can still carry on.
As long as you can remember what it was like, maybe it can be redone later. Which Yeats saying we should be extremely upset, stormily and dramatically upset about what we are losing or what we've lost, but maybe one day we can get it back because things move in great wheels. Is it something that we should look at?
Yeah,
Um, the darkening flood could be the end of everything, but it also could just be a return to the watercourse of the beginning.
right. The lake.
And of course, if Easter 1916 has been in print for some time now when The Winding Stair comes out. If Yeats writes all has changed, he's quoting himself,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yes.
Um,
So the
and
way in which it's living, what he's created is living. I mean, it's sort of enacting that. Um,
yeah, it is dramatic, it is tempestuous, it is angry,
mhm.
but it is angry about the end of a tradition, about bulldozers and wreckers
Mhm.
and norm breakers, as we say now. But it's not hopeless.
Mhm.
It is absolutely not hopeless.
I think that's great. I always the tone at the end of this poem is one that I'm always curious about, and I think what you provided is a great way of thinking about all of the ambiguities in the tone.
Thank you. Yeah, and one of the things I like about the tumultuous, tragic endings in late Yeats is because there's such a sense of musical dignity.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a sense that something is always preserved for the next generation or for the next attempt, which is what Lapis Lazuli,
Does
a
that?
very hard poem to teach now because of the super evident Orientalism. It's
Yeah.
just like, yeah, that's not going to fly. It's certainly not the poem to introduce late Yeats with anymore, if it
Mhm.
ever was.
Mhm.
Uh, but it is a valuable poem, and it is a poem in which Yeats thinks about how to be gay when bombs are going to fall on you.
All things fall and are built
House
again.
falling down. That's
Such a
right.
famous,
And
and
those
that
that build
that
them
kind
again are gay.
yeah, that kind of dignity of looking on
Yeah.
and sort of taking that broader cyclical view.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the face of the daily tumult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's a great connection.
Thank you.
Oh,
I think we might have to wrap up.
I think this is a good place to wrap up.
And we can do this again in good Yeatsian fashion when the great circle comes around and the watercourse revives itself.
Absolutely.
And in something else I think Yeats would approve of, I need to go buy some anti-capitalist fancy food. Some actually I think locally grown food,
Excellent.
which to feed my bourgeois family.
All right.
Uh, and thank you so much for the chance to do this.
Oh, Stephanie, thank you. It was really great to get a chance to see you. I haven't seen you in about over a year. It's nice
I
to see you
know.
again, and I really enjoyed talking with you about the poem. That was a lot of fun.
Let's do this again.
Yes, let's. All
Okay.
right. Take care.
Thank you. Okay.